What is going on, YouTube? Welcome back to the channel. And today I am bringing you another book review. But before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button if you want to see more content like this. And at the end, don't forget to hit like or share this for someone who needs to hear it. Now, this book in particular talks about the selective admissions process at a prestigious university in the Northeast. And it is called The Gatekeepers by Jacques Steinberg. And for a little bit of context or how this came to be, so Jacques he is a writer for the New York Times, and he followed the admissions staff at Wesleyan University in Connecticut for about a period of 8 months, around 1999 in the year 2000. And he wrote several articles which appeared on the front page of the New York Times, and this sort of grew into the book itself. So the book is really the culmination of all of those articles and the experience of following the staff around. Now, the book in particular kind of centralizes around one admissions staff in particular named Ralph, and the author really follows Ralph through the entire timeline of an admissions process. And so we get to see Ralph go out and visit high schools across the country. We get to hear about the application process, how Wesleyan tries to compete with its neighboring schools. And so if you're not really familiar with Wesleyan University, it would be considered a small private liberal arts school. And like I said, it's in Connecticut, so it's actually not too far from Yale. It's surrounded by a lot of the smaller liberal arts schools and a lot of the Ivy League schools. So they have a lot of competitors right in their backyard. So when a lot of students are looking at Wesleyan, they're also looking at a lot of the schools that are nearby as well. So it was really interesting to see how Wesleyan prepared to build its incoming class in spite of the competition and how they stood out. We also get to see the committee deliberations. So students would submit their applications. All of the admissions staff would review applications and how they're sorted out to certain staff within geographic region. And then they would talk about it as a committee. Do we approve or do we deny this admission? And you really get to see what goes into those committee discussions of how they want to build that incoming class. And when I look back at the whole book, the best thing about it is it was 100% authentic. And so what I mean is not only does Jacques follow the admissions staff and Ralph around, he also followed a handful of students. So when he mentions the students and them applying to schools, it's their real names. We learn about their real test scores, their real experiences, their decision-making process, the schools that they're considering, and ultimately if they are accepted into Wesleyan or if they are denied, where they go from there. And this made it a very immersive experience in reading the book, and that's what I love the most, because I found myself rooting for these students, really getting to know them, because the author dives into their background and what their hopes and dreams are when it comes to higher education. And also with my experience in higher education and my experience as a recruiter, I was thinking like, why did you make that decision? Or why are you ranking this? And I know you think this is important, but it's really not in the grand scheme of things. So like, don't hold that against that school and think about this school. So I really got involved in the story, and that's one of the things I loved the most. When it talks about the overall admissions process, I actually had a few takeaways that I thought were interesting because it's stuff that is still discussed today. And so it was constantly talked about college rankings, and Wesleyan was always trying to be within the top 10 when it came to the smaller liberal arts schools. But it was also interesting because they acknowledged, both the staff and the author, that college rankings are important in a sense that students are going to apply to schools that have the highest rankings, and who you admit as a college will also influence the rankings in subsequent years. And so you have this effect But also at the same time, college rankings really don't matter because they don't really indicate overall quality of experience when you attend. And I think that's an ongoing discussion. I think it's kind of a twisted game that we play still because we care about rankings as higher ed professionals and students care about rankings, but rankings are so easily manipulated and they're not very in-depth. And I think, in my personal opinion, when it comes to attending college, what you make of your experience determines a successful outcome, not necessarily which school you are attending. So that was interesting that, it's over 20 years old, still talking about it. When talking about incoming classes, since we're on that topic, diversity was a common theme in how Wesleyan was trying to not only enhance their college rankings, they acknowledged that through admitting a diverse class, but also really having that discussion of, by increasing the diversity, we're actually adding to the campus environment, and we get to really elevate what Wesleyan is. And that was one of the things in my nerd moment. I learned a lot about Wesleyan University, its history, its traditions. I got a feel for what the campus looked like. So when they were talking about who they're admitting, I think they're known for having a very active and diverse student population. So that was interesting to learn as well. So I also wanted to learn about their competitors to see, you're down the road and you're also a private school. What makes you different? What makes you unique? So that was a cool thing about the book. And the other takeaway that I got that's still being discussed is SAT scores and how they're not really indicative of college success. And there were even some schools that were mentioned in the book that were moving away from SAT scores. And I know that is a current conversation of, are we going to do test optional admissions? Because does it really matter? Does it really not? So those were some common things that are still being discussed. But overall, I loved the book. I loved how the students went through their methodical process. And I learned a lot about the admissions process in a sense that what we think is something we should put on our application or what we should write about in our essays, what we think would get us in, may not, and it actually may hurt us. And there are so many applications where students were not named, but they talked about Ralph reading these applications and sort of the student stories and where they were coming from and what they hoped to achieve. So you really got to learn about different types of college applications. And when I was reading some of the reviews, I know there were people who were, I think they felt like they expected this to be an instructional book, and they were disappointed because it just read more like a story. And yes, it did. That was the point, was just for the novel experience. But I think there were takeaways if you were paying attention. So, for example, when they were evaluating applications, these admissions officers knew the high schools. So they knew how many AP classes were offered in that high school, for example. And so then they would look at that applicant and see, did this applicant try to take all of those AP courses or only one or two? And also, how did that student do in those AP courses? They also looked at their progression through high school. Did their grades, not only were their grades consistently solid throughout their 4 years, but if they had a bad year, did they consistently increase those grades? Were they taking as many challenging courses as they could? So if there was an advanced calculus class being offered, but not necessarily required for graduation, did the student take advantage of that? Was that consistent with the student's goals? They also took into consideration whether or not the student was a first generation, and that sort of weighed into grades and performance and test scores. I think they're a little bit more forgiving of test scores if they were not as solid for first generation students or from the neighborhoods or the states that they were coming from. We looked at going back to the diversity of the incoming class, not only with race and ethnicity, but also geographic diversity. So when you are in Connecticut, they acknowledged that a lot of their students were from the northeastern United States. So they were really trying to expand out west and to the Midwest and really bringing in the diversity of thought into their incoming class. So there are a lot of little things that if you were paying attention and you made note of, you could apply that to your own experience. It was a very engaging read. It was a very smooth read. So, this channel, if you're your target population of this channel, you're a higher education professional, you're a current student, you're a prospective student, or you're a family member, or relative, or friend of a college student, I would recommend this book to all of you. I think you can learn something from it. I think it's just an enjoyable read. I just enjoyed it. It was really good. So you can find it on Amazon. I know that. And even though it's a little bit older, there were some dated references in terms of technology, but I think that aside, the story is almost timeless. So I highly recommend it. This is another great book that I loved. So go check it out. And let me know if you have read this or if there's another book similar to this or what your thoughts are with selective admissions. Let me know in the comments down below, and I will be sure to bring you more reviews like this. So as always, thank you for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.